When you think of a community like ours, you might ask yourself, who is keeping us safe? Well, the answer is firefighters, doctors, police officers, and many more. I'll be specifically talking about police officers. Are they really keeping us as safe as we think? Today, I will answer the question of why we need more police reform. While I do this, I'll be talking about hitting on topics such as police brutality, more education and training for our officers, and finally, what the popular term defund the police really means. Today, we are faced with the global problem of police brutality. Some might say that these officers are just doing their job and protecting themselves. This is wrong. I know we all remember the George Floyd case in May of 2020 and the protests that followed. These protests were to fight social and racial injustice and against police brutality, but there were excessive amounts of police brutality against the BLM protesters. According to Amnesty International, the officers' first resort to deal with these peaceful protesters was to use repeated force, chemical irritants, and rubber bullets. For the next 5 months following these protests, not a single week passed without a case of police brutality. That is 950 cases in 5 months. Ironic the fact that these protests in part were fighting against police brutality, but the sad thing is it really isn't ironic, and this is just how our police force works. Our police force is trained to recognize different types of protests and to be properly equipped with the tools necessary to safely address the protests, but clearly these protests are not being addressed safely. While I've talked about police brutality and protests, this is not the only place where this is happening. Traffic stops are another area where officers have been known to abuse their power. Carl Nazario, an Army officer, was a victim of both police brutality and blatant racism. 2 officers pulled him over and ordered him to get out of his car. They never gave him a reason, so he refused. They proceeded to pepper spray him and shove him to the ground. The topic of police brutality brings me to my next point of why officers need more education and training. In many popular cases, officers have been known to mistake simple things like a bag of Skittles, a cell phone, pill bottle, and even a sandwich as a gun. These are all real cases of people who ended up dead because our officers don't know what guns look like. If this is not enough reason for you to agree with me on the fact that our officers need more training, I'll provide you with more examples. How about all the cases where the officer said, "I thought I grabbed my taser and not my gun"? I, as well as many others, believe that if you cannot tell the difference between a taser and a gun, you should not carry either. That is a difference between 22 ounces and 7 ounces, and black for bright yellow. But our officers don't only need more education or more training, they need more education. Our police force is not equipped to handle individuals who struggle with mental illness. According to governing.com, mental health situations are responsible for 1 out of 10 police calls. This is highly alarming. In 2018 alone, 25% of the 1,000 people shot and killed by police officers suffered from a mental illness. That is 250 people. People with mental health issues are 16 times more likely to be killed by a law enforcement officer. In 2014, Jason Harrison was getting ready for his doctor's appointment. He was being difficult with his mother, so she called the police and requested for officers with experience in mental health cases. When law enforcement arrived on the scene, Harrison was holding a screwdriver. He started walking away, so they shot him 5 times and proceeded to handcuff him, although he was clearly unresponsive. While I've talked about the many reasons we need to provide our officers with more education and training, I can move on to my next topic of what the popular phrase defund the police really means. Along with my last point, people who hold the opposing view would argue that if we defund the police, we will not have enough money for education and training. This is false. Defunding the police is not the same as abolishing the police. Defunding the police simply means reallocating some of the ever-increasing budget that the police is given to other underfunded social services. According to CNBC, in Chicago, the police department was given 40.5% of the city's general budget, while mental health services received 0.9%. As we know, people with untreated mental illness are unrightfully targeted by the police. So if these mental health services were given more money, this number would hopefully be lowered. Along with mental health services, some of the money would go to our education system so that hopefully our future law enforcement officers can tell the difference between black and yellow. Some of the money would go to programs for marginalized communities, and alternative emergency response services, so that people who are in need of someone with the specific education for their needs gets that person. In Baltimore, the City Council voted to reallocate $22 million of the $500 million the police make. Their aim was to move this money to trauma centers, recreational centers, and loans for Black-owned businesses, which are all areas that not only in Baltimore but everywhere need it more than the police do. Now, I hope you have all learned about the proper meaning of defund the police. Now, I finally hit all my topics involving police brutality, more education and training for our officers, and finally, what the popular term defund the police really means. I hope that you have all learned something about how our police force really works, and while I know I cannot change everyone's mind, I hope that at least a few people might reconsider and agree with me on why our police force needs more reform.